Hey, good afternoon, folks, again, and good morning to our friends in the West Coast. This is Craig Verstati with EDA's Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. We are getting started here. So we did an audio test earlier. It sounds like everyone can hear me loud and clear. If you do have any questions throughout this presentation, feel free to drop them in the text box like many of you have already. Let's get started. So yeah, that's me. Real pleasure to be here. I've had a fun time working with many of you over the last 5 years in this office, and I know it's never fun hearing the news that you weren't selected, but I do mean it when I say it, and it is fun working with such a great group of mission-focused economic development, entrepreneurship professionals in the field. Today's conversation is going to focus on, the purpose here is to provide a debrief on the trends and issues seen in the 2019 Regional Innovation Strategies Program competition. In light of that, I'd like to start off with a quick personal practice or issue that always pains me to see, and I know Emily will introduce herself shortly, and she has one as well. And so for me, I'd like to start off with one of my pet peeves that really irks me to see in applications, and it happened with a number of folks this year, is that when applicants fall short on technical proficiency, meaning that they failed to submit some sort of critical documentation, missed the mark on the minimum match requirements, because that means no matter how good the rest of the application was, it is technically deficient, and we simply cannot review it. And I know how much work goes into this stuff. So it always pains me to see great applications get cut short by administrative deficiencies. So when we talk through some of those today, please be sure you pay attention and are thinking through how you can cleanly organize future applications so you can put the best foot forward. And now I'd love to introduce you to Emily.
Hey everybody, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Emily Miller. I'm a policy advisor here in the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and as a fairly recent addition to the team, I can tell you that this competition cycle was definitely competitive, and it was really a pleasure to read all the applications, and I know so many of you put the blood, sweat, and tears into this, so hopefully today is a productive session. I won't maybe talk about a pet peeve necessarily, but I'll talk about something that I've seen through this competition cycle that really stuck out to me in good applications. I'm a former entrepreneur myself, and I feel like one of the things that organizations and entrepreneurs do really well that stands out is when you have a really compelling problem and solution. So that's one trend that I've seen. I think a lot of applications, sometimes they didn't do as good of a job to really define those problems and solutions in their regions. And they kind of talked more broadly, about their demographics or their region, but really honing in on what is the problem that you're trying to solve and how will your organization fill that gap and be that solution. I think any compelling entrepreneur who is pitching has to make that case, and I think it's a very similar thing in this competition. So really excited to talk to you all today, and I hope you're able to glean some insights for next year's round.
All right, thanks, Emily, and let's dive into the specifics of today. And to start with, I want to talk about some assumptions that we've made heading into this event. Attendees, so you all in the audience have applied for the most recent competition. This is not an introductory webinar on EDA or introductory webinar for the RIS program. I'm also hoping that attendees, this audience today, represent leaders behind the programs. This is not necessarily for kind of grant office personnel, people behind some of the administrative side. This is really going to talk about some of the high-level strategy. There are certainly some administrative requirements we'll discuss, but those are really aligned with our strategic goals of the program. So please make sure that if you're not that person, that you do your best to convey this information to the right leadership on your team. We're going to take a look at trends across the entire pool of applications. This will not be for discussing specific examples or too many of them, or we're going to individual case studies, I should say. We'll highlight some examples that we saw, but those examples should only or will only convey actual trends and reflect broader issues that we saw across the portfolio. It certainly was a competitive year. As you see right here, we had 183 total applications, 44 grants were made. This is about on par with every year. This is truly a competition. This is, I mean, there are other, excuse me, outside of merit, there are certainly other priorities that we have, which are outlined in grants officer selection criteria, such as geographic and programmatic diversity. So for those of you who might have been competing against a number of folks within your region, that might be one of the many reasons why we weren't able to select a number of proposals in a particular region. But nonetheless, overall, this is what we're dealing with this year, and just really want to emphasize that a non-select is not indicative of your readiness or competitiveness. It just is a highly demanded program. So it sounds like some folks are having some audio problems right now. We're going to take a quick pause so we can distribute the call-in number here. Stand by, folks. All right, looks like we're up and running with a lot of folks. Thanks for your patience. Jeremy, your question, can we ask via voice? We have muted all participants and ask that you submit any questions via text in the chat group. That's to keep things quiet and clean since we have a number of participants. So please just contribute any questions via the chat group, and we'll answer them as they come along and as are relevant. So moving past this competitive point here around the program, let's talk about the process and what those 183 applications went through. This is how we'll break down today's presentation. We'll talk briefly about the technical review, the merit review, and then what ultimately the selection. So today's agenda, we're going to address some high-level trends across fatal technical issues, and then moving into the more merit side of the program, which is program alignment and fit, and into common issues and trends, closing with more questions. If you do have questions relevant to topics as we broach them, please drop them in the chat box. We'll try to get to them as best we can. All right, so Emily was really in the trenches this year on a lot of the technical pieces, and so I've asked her to offer her expertise on this side today.
Hey, everybody. So like Craig mentioned earlier, I'm going to walk you through the technical review. And let me just preface all this to say that I think this one is near and dear to my heart because there were a number of very competitive, solid applications that didn't make it through technical review this year for very simple administrative mistakes. So I wanted to cover kind of the most common mistakes that we saw so that hopefully you can avoid this in the future. Really pains me to see good applications have to drop for pretty simple things. So I'd say I'm going to go into each of these in depth, but at a high level, Missing required documentation was a very big one. Whether that was the SPOC requirement, the single point of contact for intergovernmental review. Sometimes it was around nonprofit documentation, whether that's articles of incorporation, bylaws, things like that. And also eligibility, so proving that you are an eligible entity able to apply to our program. And one thing I just want to point out is that at the very end of our NOFO in Appendix D, we lay out 2 checklists. Literally, you can go line by line, and we will show you, for the type of organization that you are, what is required in the application. So I highly recommend going through that checklist with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that everything you're submitting is full and correct. Outside of the missing required documentation, the second big issue was around match. So whether that was ineligible match or there was, basically not enough match. For our programs, we do require a 1-to-1 match. So for every federal dollar that's requested, you must have a non-federal dollar match with it. And we'll go through kind of some of the nuances that we saw there.
Yeah, Emily, let me point out real quick, that's a good highlight, because I know many of you who are familiar with some of our other EDA programs might have have been able to pursue a different match rate, or excuse me, a federal grant at a different match rate under a different EDA program. This program, hands down, no matter what, no matter where you're at, no matter your distress level or your organization, the minimum is 1-to-1. Just wanted to clarify that.
And Ryan, we just saw your question. Yes, we will post. We're actually recording this meeting as we speak, so we'll have the recording posted, and we will also have the slides and notes available for you afterwards. The last thing I'll say before moving to the next slide is that we have an optional pre-submission technical review. That means that before the competition window closes, you have a period of time in which you can submit your application to your regional RIS rep for an optional pre-submission technical review. And I highly recommend prioritizing time to give yourself an extra week or 2 before the competition window closes for this. The RIS reps can go through your application. They'll let you know if it meets our requirements for technical review, and they'll let you know if you're missing any documentation. So please keep that in mind for next year, that is certainly an option. All right, so first up for the technical review, intergovernmental review. Many states have what's called the single point of contact review, so SPOC. In the NOFO and in our frequently asked questions, we provide this very link. It is the updated 2019 version. It lists every single state. It'll tell you whether they require intergovernmental review or not, and will also give you the point of contact name and contact information. This is tricky, right? Different states have different approaches to intergovernmental review. Some states don't require it at all, and in that case, you're clear and in the free. Other states do require it. And I want to note here that there are a few outlying states. I don't know the exact number totally, but we've got a few examples that we ran into this year, particularly Iowa, Maryland, and West Virginia that do participate in SPOC review, but they make exceptions by program. So certain federal programs are required, others are not, and so that, we really, you should definitely get in touch with these folks early, get clarification on what the requirements are for your state. And lastly, validate your service area state requirements. If you're working across state lines, make sure that you know those states' requirements as well, and ensure that you comply when submitting your application. Next up is eligibility. So we've had, this year, just as an example, we're very clear in our NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which organization types are eligible for our funding. And we've had multiple instances this year of some for-profit entities applying. For-profit entities can, in some circumstances, apply, and we're very clear about what those circumstances are. But a few for-profits this year applied and did not include any documentation or required forms. So we had a for-profit apply that also referenced their nonprofit arm, but there was no documentation from that nonprofit. which deemed them ineligible. We also had other for-profit entities apply. They might have been economic development organizations. They might have been in a public-private partnership. They might have had co-applicants, but again, they provided no documentation or supporting forms to clarify that. And because of that, those for-profits were considered ineligible. So I highly recommend going back to read the NOFO, page 9, very clear on eligibility, and also our FAQs. They're all posted on the website. Next up were the matching issues. So this year, we had multiple issues with match kind of across applications. I'm pulling a real example here, and this text reads, applicant commits to use commercially reasonable efforts to lead the creation of a $750,000 investment fund. If and when such funds are raised by the investment fund, that will then trigger a grant of $750,000. So this language is problematic. It does not meet our standards for unencumbered, unrestricted, and committed at the time of award. I think the big thing to highlight here is that this does not read to us as committed match. It seems as if the match is uncertain, as if the match might be available in the future, but there's no assurance. Sometimes there was solid language, but the match wasn't signed by an authorized representative. So just keep in mind, we lay out very clear language that we need to see in the match commitment letters for it to be deemed eligible. It must be unencumbered, unrestricted, and committed at the time of award. And make sure that your matching sources clearly sync to your budget narrative and your 424. I know that this sounds pretty basic, but this is an issue that we saw over and over again across many applications. The numbers simply didn't align. So do the math, take the time, be thoughtful, be consistent in how you're laying out your numbers. I know for many of you, you had multiple sources of match, which is completely fine. But a lot of those numbers didn't add up, and we'll go through one of those examples.
All right, I want to jump on some of the meatier stuff, and I know everyone on here is now likely a good to great or has a good to great understanding of the Regional Innovation Strategies program, because all of you who are attending this webinar submitted an application last year. So I'm assuming that there's a good understanding about these two competitions. But I want to highlight that I'll highlight a couple differences between the competitions throughout the next part of this presentation. And I'll start with I-6. This is business acceleration, business support, with a strong emphasis on high tech, high growth. The I-6 challenge is not for Main Street small business support. Seed fund support grant competition is for equity-based capital efforts. We're trying to support the formation, launch, and growth of equity-based capital efforts. That might be angel networks, that might be a traditional venture fund. You could call that many different things, but emphasis on equity-based. We're not doing debt here. This is not small business loans. All right, with that in mind, the two grants, these were what was on the table this year. $750 for I-6, $300 for seed fund, both at a 1-to-1 match. All right, we've got the framework set. Let's talk about the applications itself. After technical review, they went into merit review, and each application was reviewed by a minimum of 3 federal innovation entrepreneurship experts. We pulled reviewers like previous years from NASA, from Small Business Administration, from Department of Treasury, Department of Energy, all coming from different program offices that are supporting different types of innovation and entrepreneurship. I think that's an important note because it's important to think who's going to be reviewing this and making sure that your application can resonate with an audience that may not have deep technical expertise in biotech, ag tech, advanced manufacturing, or whatever industry your program is representing. So on that note, on the communication note and organization, I'd like to start off with some real examples where project narratives struggled. One, had a really great program that we've been partners with over the years through different EDA efforts, but they spent 5 pages discussing their location and region. We know there's a 10-page limit for the project narrative. Be strategic on how you tell your story. This may sound common sense or pretty straightforward, but we see it every year. We saw a draft version from an amazing organization, but they submitted a draft version with highlights and markups and edits of their proposal. A number of proposals were verbose and confusing, disjointed, and last but not least, a lack of evidence. Again, many of these sounds pretty straightforward and common sense, but I really think this comes down to preparation, people rushing to get things done, not having enough time to QC their proposal. And I guess maybe my point here is we're excited for 2020. There should be nothing stopping you from getting started now, so you're not rushed and don't end up with any of these issues next year. All right, so next up, and with respect to the program, the specific programs and our objectives and some of the outcomes that I just described on the I-6 and the seed fund grant. With the I-6, I think the majority of folks that struggled, they weren't really aligned with the technology focus of our program. Or maybe a better way to say that is not aligned, but rather did not convey a compelling enough argument that you were truly able to mature technologies, help commercialization, taking them out of the lab from concept to idea to scale. For those that don't have those resources nearby, maybe you're a rural community, maybe you're a small community college, we certainly want to see proposals from you, and we have a number of those types of entities in our portfolio, and those that are succeeding have implemented creative strategies to partner with technology and innovation hubs or assets related to. Like we cannot expect every community to have a tier 1 research university, but rather how do you create the conditions to source innovations, to unlock and enable tech businesses. If you have a deep expertise and maybe history in supporting small business development, that's great, but you need to clearly articulate where, if you're trying to move from that space and into higher tech, higher growth, be sure you can clearly articulate how you're going to do that. Be wary of the if we build it, they will come mentality. It does take some strategic relationships, partnerships, and whatnot to make that happen. And that's what we hope this grant can do. So how will you be using this grant to unlock that type of potential for your community? On the seed fund side, and maybe this was because we saw a number of newcomers to the table this year, but there was a number that just did not understand what the seed fund grant was trying to do. A number of proposals saw the seed fund as a seed fund for their accelerator, as if we were going to grant their accelerator a grant to run their accelerator. Maybe that's because of the name, and this is a seed fund grant, but that is not the case. We're really focused on forming, launching, and scaling cluster-focused seed funds. So I don't want to get into all the details of that right now because, again, everyone here should have a fundamental understanding of that. But if you're trying to do accelerator-like activities, you're most likely a fit for I6. And we saw a couple angel groups and other entities that were possibly aligned with the seed fund outcomes, but the majority of their project was focused on accelerator-like activities and did not clearly connect to how those accelerator activities were going to lead to the formation, launch, and scale of new capital in the region. So that is a really important line to understand, and because we've had angel groups, venture funds, clearly many of them in our seed fund portfolio, but some of them also have fallen into our I6 category. So understand what your desired outcome is and where it falls in either of these buckets is really important. I mostly saw that on the seed fund side this year. And again, I think it was because we had a number of newcomers that might have misunderstood what the goals of the seed fund were for. So next up, so for support and commitment letters, Emily touched on some of the budget criteria and where we look for a match, some of those items. More largely or broadly here, I think there was, I don't know if this was due to time constraints or what, but some good organizations put forth some very generic pro forma style support letters, some of them not even mentioning the program, but rather just, we support this entity and their work, and not diving into how what their I6 proposal was going to mean for the community or how it was going to benefit that particular organization's efforts. We want to better understand how this work is going to be valued across the community, who's partnering, and pro forma essays don't help us do that. A real fatal issue, Emily touched on this a bit, is not clearly articulating the matching funds. That's that second bullet there. We really need and require folks to break down what the match commitment is, its valuation, where it's going, and it should be consistent with the budget narrative. So if you're getting a commitment letter from an organization that says we are committing $100,000 to X part of this program, we should see that $100,000 reflected in the budget narrative. This could be a fatal issue. Many of them we were able, not many, but there were a few where it was clearly there, but we needed some clarification. And I'll talk about that on the budget side shortly and how to best communicate that. But it should be pretty clear. We should be able to pull up a commitment letter and immediately contrast it with the budget and see how they're tied together. Last but not least, a lack of relevance in some. I don't know if this was, I can't read everyone's minds, but I don't know if this is a quantity over quality thing where people think that putting a dozen or 2 dozen forward is going to help them. I think, if anything, that level of quantity, if you have 2 dozen support letters, it can sometimes raise a flag for us. Who is really truly involved in this, and who are the key partners and beneficiaries, and how is this going to move the community forward? So important to focus on quality over quantity. All right, moving to budget here. This is a generic example, but looking at 4 different documents: the 424A, the budget narrative, the staffing plan, and the match commitment letter. I've outlined categories for personnel. On the left, you see personnel in the 424A at $185,000. On the far right, you see a match commitment letter that is for $90,000 for a venture lead. The staffing plan outlines $180,000 for staff, and the budget narrative is $280,000. This is a very real example. We saw this many times in some way, shape, or form where there were some to many inconsistencies across different budget categories. If you look at the match commitment letter, this is basic math. 20 hours per week, 52 weeks per year at an hourly rate of $91, I get $95,000. But the commitment letter said $90,000, so I've got a $5,000 discrepancy there. On my staffing plan, the submitting organization says that it's $85,000 in part of the budget. I don't clearly articulate whether that is match, but I think it is because it's in the match commitment letter. But then if I back into my overall personnel cost of my 424A, I see $185,000. You know, we can infer a couple things from this, but bottom line is we certainly cannot walk away from this data here with the confidence on what exactly is being committed under the personnel part of the budget. So if I were to pull this line item out, ultimately what right looks like is clarity across the application. I understand what the top line personnel numbers are, and I can populate exactly what is going into that line from the staffing plan and the commitment letters and who's doing what. That would be an example of a great complete budget proposal. Hopefully this spurs some ideas and it enables you to look back at your submission and see where you can improve. I will say that this may not be fatal, but what Emily described is not having enough match, not clearly articulating that match is unencumbered and readily available, that absolutely is fatal. So what we're talking about here is kind of competitiveness and how we look at the holistic merit of the application. I will say that we have a number of awardees that had some budget issues. So this is not fatal here, but rather if you look across your entire application and how you're communicating what you're going to do with our funds, how it will be leveraged, the strategy behind it, the team behind it, you know, the talent, the skills, et cetera, all these factor together to help us understand or evaluate the competitiveness of the proposal. That is why it's not simply of like, what did I do wrong? It is very, very challenging for us to point to, this is what you did wrong, this is what you need to improve, and you will get an award next year. As you can imagine, it's nearly impossible to hone in on that, and why we're unable to provide specific recommendations on what you can do. We're synthesizing this in broad trends so you can reevaluate what you submitted and how you can work on it next year. For those that have a lot of experience, maybe you've participated in one of our programs before, either under the RIS portfolio or with EDA in the past. I'll be blunt. If you're requesting funds for a similar project in the same region, you need to be really honest with yourself. Is this truly going to improve what we've been doing and where we're going? And if so, you need to articulate that. There were a number of previous recipients that were more or less rinsing off a former application, proposal or project and resubmitting it 3-4 years later. Be sure you can connect to new impacts and a clear path forward in building on prior work. The third bullet there, I'm sad to admit, we see it every year. I saw, I sense a little bit more of it this year. people getting creative with partnerships, but doing the same work on as a current RIS grant. Again, be honest with yourselves. Put yourselves in our shoes. Are we going to feel comfortable funding the same type of project just because you've partnered with a different lead applicant? If you feel compelled to do that, again, sell us a compelling message. What's the added impacts here? My perspective is that let's figure out what works on this first project, on whatever active project is there, and build on that. We also do recognize, and with that said, we recognize that not all projects work. This is, at the end of the day, this is an innovation grant program, and we ourselves try to practice what we preach and want to test some ideas. So there are a number of projects that haven't been as successful as we had hoped, but if that's the case, acknowledge that as well. We learned from X. This is what didn't work. This is what did. It almost felt like some folks were trying to circumvent the obvious, and that just doesn't play well with us. Last but not least, prior performance issues just goes without saying. Make sure you're honest and real about the team you have and the ability to get stuff done. Workforce, this was a new component for the I-6 challenge this year, emphasis on component. I don't know if there were some of you that might have done a keyword search in grants.gov or what, but this is not a workforce development program. The I-6 challenge and the RIS program overall is about commercialization, new business starts in the high-tech field. We recognize, though, that talent can be a gap, especially in regions that lack a robust pipeline in certain sectors, a robust talent pipeline. So if you had a strong to heavy workforce focus in your proposal, here are some things that we saw. A K-12 STEM education program that was exactly that. That was not really aligned with growing entrepreneurship and commercialization. An advanced manufacturing apprenticeship development effort. We recognize that advanced manufacturing is a great driver for our regional innovation economies right now, but that proposal and some others that touched in that arena lacked a clear connection to how advanced manufacturing was connected to the entrepreneurial aspect of that region, or maybe more directly, what the advanced manufacturing startups were doing and how talent would drive those startups. So my point here is, if talent is to be a future component, emphasis on component, you need to think about how talent is driving innovation and commercialization. This is not a workforce development program. So with that, we've quickly run through high level of some of the trends and issues we saw in this year's applications. And I want to talk about next year. Get thinking about that now. We're excited to be modernizing the program a bit to reflect hopefully a leaner application process for you all. We hope we'll see that in 2020 with a two-phased proposal process where an initial phase would be a concept proposal submission where just is this idea in line with the RIS program and the desired outcomes for the I-6 challenge with the Seed Fund Support Grant, and we would invite the most competitive proposals back for a full application phase. We anticipate a similar timeline, though, overall, as to this year, which was a release in early February of 2019, and awards were made in July. So I expect we'll see that same timeline in 2020, an early release, early calendar release in 2020, so sometime in February, and then in a mid-year award time frame. Of course, that is pending our budget environment and overall appropriations. Last year we were hit by the record federal furlough, so that was tough. That slowed us down a bit, but we still did make our commitment, which we had put out the winter prior, of a February 1st release date. So I was happy to make that happen, and our goal there is to put this program on a regular cadence so you all, our stakeholders, can expect and plan around that. Other than that, and switching up some of the application process, we expect the program to reflect very similar goals and priorities. We do not anticipate any major changes on the desired activities and outcomes here. Should look fairly similar. So with that, I want to open up to any questions about any of the points we addressed today. I know we may not have gotten as specific as many of you would have liked, but again, it's really challenging, as we said, to hone in on too many specifics for every application, because it's such a large package and there's so many components to it. Any broad questions for the group at this time? So Paul just wanted to mention that, yes, these slides will be available. The recording will be made available as well. We'll post it to the website. So all of this should be packaged up and ready to distribute to your teams as needed. All right, a couple more good questions coming in. If you still want additional feedback, I'd ask two things from you. One, I'd ask that you and your staff review your application. After you've reviewed your application and you've participated in this webinar, or you've reviewed this webinar, and you still have further questions, let us know. You can reach out to your regional point of contact, and we'll sit down and talk through thoroughly. But why I say that is because time and time again, we are engaged by folks who say, I'd like feedback on our application. I'd like to understand what we can improve on because I did not put the application together. So if you're not, and this is what I emphasize at the top of this call, if you weren't part of the strategic leadership team that put the application together, it's very hard for you to understand where you could have improved with respect to this webinar. So do us the favor, if you're asking for our time, please put some time on re-reviewing your application with the context of this webinar, and then let us know that, and let us know that you'd still like more feedback. And someone from our regional offices, so for those in the Southeast, that's Robin Cooley. In the Northeast, that's Chevis Granum. In the Northwest, that's Brian Parker in our Seattle office. And then Emily and I, Emily or I here at headquarters will be happy to engage, but only if you've re-reviewed your own application and this webinar. That's one favor that I ask that you guys meet. Technical reviews, same thing. If you don't understand, if you were technically proficient, I ask that you look at your technical requirements, and if it's unclear, if you submitted a technically proficient application, then please engage us. But we provide a checklist, and you all understand what you submitted, and if you're still uncertain, let us know. But again, 9 times out of 10, what we find is people intentionally submitted an incomplete application, hoping that it would get passed anyway. Looking at these questions, any others, folks? Judy's question on demonstrated success. You know, that's a good thought. Are you more competitive if you have demonstrated success? I wish I could quantifiably discuss this as far as a breakdown of our awards and the awards that we've made to new programs versus awards we've made to established programs that have demonstrated success. I do think that programs that have demonstrated success, that's a larger group that is represented in our portfolio, but it's not for the reasons you might think. I believe that programs that have not demonstrated success have a harder time articulating what they're trying to do and exactly how they fit in the regional system. Here's why: because they're new and they're still discovering the true product market fit. I like what Emily said around really understanding the problem that you're addressing and how you can address it. A majority of the programs that we see that are new and don't have an established track record just have a harder time presenting that. So I think how you overcome that is with some proven evidence, some research. Perhaps you're working to apply a program or a process in your region that has worked in similar regions. Are you transferring some successful application of a commercialization effort in a rural community to your rural community, or from one university to another university? Establishing credibility that way is one great way to do it. And the other last piece, I think why you see more established programs with maybe some track record in the portfolio is also because of the grant application itself. It is challenging, and we understand that it's challenging to pull together one of these applications, and I think larger teams do tend to have more resources, and which is why we're trying to modernize the process next year and hopefully make it more obtainable for earlier, leaner teams that might not have as much grant writing resources. David's question: are grant applications that were selected available for review? We do not publish those, and that is really intentional. Reason being is we don't want a cookie cutter approach. You're welcome to collaborate, and I encourage you to reach out to folks in the field to see awardees that receive grants and see if they're willing to share. But there's a reason why we don't publish those, because we want to see what is uniquely best for your region, your programs, and whatnot. There's also a number of professional organizations that do great work here. Whether it's NBIA or the State Science Technology Institute, SSTI, and others that are doing great work here and sharing knowledge and best practices. And I'd encourage folks to look into both of those organizations if you're not aware already. So there's some questions about regional balance, and I will say that we do work hard to make investments that are reflective of the U.S. economy. We do not have a specific quota for a particular, for any of our regions, whether that's geographic regions or actual regional offices. We don't have an investment mark, but we do closely watch our investments with respect to per capita. So how dense is your region, your state, and your city? That is definitely an important criteria for us. We don't want to over-concentrate certain risk dollars in areas. But I mentioned the regional components because it's always an important thought for us, because as you might imagine, we do get a high number of applications from the coasts, where you have a larger concentration of university activity, especially in the Northeast, where you have some of the longest running research institutions spanning Philadelphia and Boston and New York and others, and of course along the West Coast too, from Seattle down through San Francisco and Sacramento. There's a great concentration of university and research activity there. So we do see a concentration of applications, but that doesn't mean that we concentrate our awards there. Again, our awards are reflective of the U.S. population and the current economic activity. I think there was also a mention of sectoral consideration. We do look at that as well, and what our portfolio represents across sectors. And we try to balance that as well. So we're starting to see some of the new and upcoming sectors represented, as far as some UAV, UAS technology, space commercialization, aquaculture, marine commercialization activity. We're seeing more of those. And then some of the sectors that the U.S. has led in for some time, particularly health, bio, we have a number of those reflected in the portfolio. Software, of course, manufacturing, maker spaces, prototyping, things like that. See a lot of those as well. Hoping to continue to practice that balance moving forward, and hoping to see more applications, proposals around our new emerging innovation sectors in the future as well. Brandy, I want to touch base on your workforce question. I'll read that. Can you give more information on the workforce element? What was the idea behind it, to create more entrepreneurs or more people who could work for high-tech startups? I'll ask the question right back at you. I think what does your region, what does your community need? We realize that talent is a larger growing component of driving an innovation economy. And like many aspects of the RIS program, we think that this portfolio can address different aspects or different gaps in a community. If you have high growth startups that lack access to a certain skill set within the region, maybe it is focused on, maybe you have a cluster of software and data-oriented companies, and there's not a great pipeline of software engineers and data scientists. What can you do to participate in some of the talent development or talent matching so your businesses can access that talent locally, scale hopefully better, faster, more efficiently with local talent instead of having to recruit from expensive markets? That's one example. Another example, as far as teaching, equipping entrepreneurs, I think that's addressed by many of the acceleration program proposals we get, a business acceleration, where you have entrepreneurs learning best practices and you're training these future business leaders in how to build and scale a company. So there are no prescribed best approaches for the workforce component. And it is not, and with that, I also want to emphasize, this is not a must aspect or criteria in the I-6, but rather this is one way that we do see some regions, some organizations starting to address the gaps in their ecosystem. All right, folks, I think that runs it today. The last one, no, I'll answer. Are there certain structures or types of seed funds? So our singular requirement right now on the seed fund support grant is that there must be a component of equity. That is a statutory regulation of ours that we can only support funds that plan to invest in an equity transaction. There are a number of models that could accomplish that, to include convertible notes that often have the converting note to equity, obviously. So I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but just emphasizing that the equity transaction is the important component. This is not a debt vehicle whatsoever. All right, thanks everyone for your time today. Top of the hour. This is going to be posted on our website in the coming days. We do have to do some file transfers and whatnot, so give us some time. But please be on the lookout for our 2020 cycle, and looking forward to seeing more of you next year, hopefully with stronger and more impactful proposals. Have a great day.